I had been a compact integration liaison officer for 12 years before I made the kind of mistake that can only be made by someone who has done the job too long and too well. The trouble with doing a job well is that it starts to feel like doing it correctly and doing it rightly are the same thing. For 11 of those 12 years I had believed that. I had a good record. I filed clean reviews. I maintained unimpeachable timelines. I had never once had a formal complaint upheld against me. My supervisor, a compact and deliberate woman named Velthar Orvis, who had been running the treaty processing wing of Threscale Station for 9 years before I arrived, called me her most reliable secondary officer. I had always taken that as a compliment. I am writing this now from a position of clearer sight, and I understand it differently. Reliable is not the same as right. Clean is not the same as careful. And 12 years of doing things correctly to the letter will hollow out a man's instincts for the spirit underneath the letters, if he lets it. I let it. I had not known I was letting it happen, which is, I have found, the most common version of that particular failure. The people who let their precision become their blindness are not usually people who made a conscious trade-off. They are people who stopped examining the thing that was working well enough because it was working well enough, and moved to the next thing on the desk. I had a great many things on the desk. The treaty processing wing of Threscale Station runs 22 active renegotiation processes in a standard review cycle, and the Integration Coordination Office manages all of them through a secondary liaison structure that distributes assignments across 7 officers. I carried, on average, 4 active assignments at any given time. In 12 years, I had managed something in the range of 300 treaty processes. I had developed efficiencies. I had developed the kind of efficiency that looks, from the outside, like expertise and feels, from the inside, like the sensation of having done something so many times that you no longer notice the texture of it. The texture, as it turned out, had a subsection. The Queen Regent arrived on a Tuesday. This is how I always think of it now. The Tuesday she arrived, the Wednesday I failed her, the Thursday I saw her at the east observation window, the Friday I went back to correct it. 4 days. The most consequential 4 days of my 12 years on the outer posting circuit, and for the first 2 of them I did not notice anything significant was happening at all. Her name was Ethys Orville. She was Queen Regent of the Kethorvath sovereignty, which meant she held provisional governing authority for a territory of some 14 settlement stations and 3 inhabited moon systems, while the young sovereign, her nephew, completed his formal education and preparation for accession. She was 37 years old, which I knew because I had read her delegation file 3 times before she arrived. I always read delegation files 3 times. The first reading gives you the facts. The second reading gives you the shape of the person the facts describe. The third reading gives you what the file is not saying, which is often more useful than everything else. What her file said: Queen Regent for 4 years, 11 previous treaty processes with the Compact, a record of outcomes consistently in the upper tier for outer sovereignty processes, delegation structure consistently small and precise, 0 formal complaints filed or received, 0 corrected determinations on any of the 15 liaison officer files associated with her previous processes. She had never caused a procedural problem and had never, as far as any file admitted, experienced one. She arrived with her needle threaded and her documentation organized and her questions prepared. What her file was not saying, which I identified in the third reading as a structural pattern worth noting: she had been Queen Regent for 4 years, and she had been in formal treaty process with the Compact's integration apparatus for nearly the full span of that authority. Full integration review in year 1. Supplemental resource sharing review in year 2. Security clearance recertification for her entire delegation in year 3. Full legacy agreement renegotiation in year 4. She had been doing this continuously, with a small delegation, against the full procedural weight of the Integration Directorate's framework. She had an unbroken record of outcomes because she had prepared correctly for each of them, which means she had been preparing correctly for 4 years without a pause. I noted this as professional context and filed it accordingly. I did not at that stage draw from it the conclusion I later drew. You can only see certain things from a particular vantage, and the vantage I had on Tuesday was the vantage of a reliable secondary liaison officer with clean review history and a full desk, reading context into a delegation file. She came into my filing room on the Wednesday morning at 900 with 2 of her officers, precisely the number the delegation protocol allows in a secondary review meeting, and she was the kind of delegate who never exceeded the permitted number by even 1. I noticed this because I noticed that kind of precision, and because her precision made the opening of the review easier than most. She had arrived prepared. Every document her delegation had been required to submit was submitted, organized, and cross-referenced in the way that saves review time and signals that the person on the other side of the desk has done real work. She had read the Integration Directorate's current renegotiation framework in its entirety, which I identified in the first 20 minutes because the questions she asked were the questions of someone who had read the document carefully and found the places where it did not fully explain itself, and who wanted those places explained. That kind of preparation is not common in outer sovereignty delegation reviews. It requires time and attention, and a specific quality of seriousness that cannot be faked. It also makes a liaison officer's job difficult in the specific way that any exceptional delegate makes the job difficult, because preparation of that quality demands a response of equal quality in return. She would know if I was citing from memory where I should be citing from text. She would know if I was providing a partial answer and was aware I was doing it. I had enough professional respect for the work she had clearly put in to give her the full version of every answer she asked for, including the answers that were long and technically involved, and I did. She did not take notes while I spoke. She listened with the quality of attention that does not require notes because what is being said is being received and organized in real time. I have worked with thousands of delegation officers over 12 years, and I can count on one hand the number who listen like that. She was shorter than I had expected from her file's height notation. The Kethorvath ruling house is Velsorn line, which runs tall on average, and the translation of her listed height put her roughly at my own. What the file had not captured, what files rarely capture, was the quality of stillness she carried. She sat in the secondary review chair across my desk and was entirely still in the way a person is still when they have long since stopped needing to perform composure because they simply have it. Her skin was copper bronze in the filing room's standard overhead lighting, with the particular quality that Velsorn skin carries in artificial light, a warmth that reads almost like its own source, as though the light in the room is partly hers and partly the overhead panels and you cannot quite determine the proportion. Her hair was close-cropped, very dark, nearly mahogany, and she wore the formal Kethorvath sovereignty delegation insignia at the left collar of a gray-end copper coat that was precisely regulation and entirely her own. Her eyes were amber gold with a thin silver inner ring that caught the overhead light when she turned her head. She turned her head precisely and not often. When she was listening, she was looking at me with the full quality of her attention, and the full quality of her attention was not something I had encountered at that register in a review session in some time. The review ran correctly through its first 40 minutes. I presented the current status breakdown of their legacy agreements, gave full time for questions between sections, cited applicable protocol sections with what I believed was accuracy. She asked 7 questions across the first portion of the review, and all 7 of them were better formulated than I would have produced from her side of the desk. The 4th one identified an ambiguity in the renegotiation framework document that I had never noticed, and that was, I found when I checked, genuinely there. I told her I would note it for the Framework Review Board. She said she had already submitted it to them through the delegation documentation channel. I said that was efficient. She said the ambiguity had produced problems in her previous review, and she had not wanted it to produce problems in this one. We reached the resource access section at approximately 9:50. The Kethorvath legacy agreements included a secondary medical supply clause filed under the Integration Directorate's Outer Compact Supplement Framework. The Outer Compact Supplement Framework had been superseded in the Charter revision 3 years ago. Under the current Charter, secondary supplement clauses cannot be carried forward into renegotiated agreements without a separate refiling process governed by Protocol 16. Protocol 16 establishes that any legacy secondary clause refiling must be submitted at least 60 standard days before the primary renegotiation review date. The Kethorvath delegation had submitted their renegotiation request 47 days before the review date, 13 days short of the window. I had identified this discrepancy when I was building the review materials the previous week. I had noted it, checked the applicable subsections of Protocol 16, subsections A through D, confirmed that the 60-day requirement applied and was not met, and made a notation in my review file that I would need to address the secondary clause in the review session. I had done this correctly. I had done every part of the process correctly by the standards of the sections I had checked. I told her the medical supply clause could not be carried forward under Protocol 16 because the refiling window had not been met by the submission date. The clause would need to be handled in a separate refiling process, which would add a minimum of 60 additional days to its resolution. I told her clearly, with the applicable protocol citation. I gave her the refiling documentation reference numbers. I told her I was sorry for the inconvenience, which is the standard thing to say in this situation, and which I meant in the standard way, which is to say, approximately. She looked at me for a moment before responding. The stillness she had maintained through the first 40 minutes of the review shifted fractionally, a fraction less settled, a fraction more assessing. I noticed it because the stillness had been so complete that the small change was perceptible. Then she said, very evenly, that she understood and would consult with her data specialists about the refiling options. She thanked me for the clarification. She thanked me formally and without warmth and without complaint, which is the correct professional register for the situation, and which I noted as such and moved past. I completed the review. I filed the notes. I forwarded the standard documentation to the delegation. I moved to the next assignment on my desk, and I did not think about the Kethorvath delegation again until 300 the following morning. I have a habit that dates back to my third outer posting. Station quarters at Threshkale were designed for people who do not notice ventilation systems, and I have always noticed ventilation systems. The station runs a maintenance pass at 300 that produces a 17-minute increase in airflow through the residential corridor, and a low-frequency hum that occupies the same tonal range as the thoughts that prevent sleep. After years of trying to sleep through it and failing, I stopped trying and started simply getting up. I walked the treaty processing wing in the hours between 2:30 and 5:30. The corridors are empty. The kind of thinking that does not happen at a desk happens in motion, in low light, in a space that is otherwise occupied by the working day and becomes, in those hours, briefly yours. On Thursday morning, I came around the corner from the filing corridor and saw that the light was still on in the East Observation Terrace. The East Observation Terrace is a narrow corridor branching off the main treaty processing wing, opening onto a viewport that runs the full length of the eastern docking ring exterior. Delegation officers use it for off-hours thinking. It is rarely occupied after 100. I glanced through the angled glass divider as I passed and saw the light was on and a figure was at the far end of the viewport. I would have continued walking. I nearly did. The glass divider between the main corridor and the terrace is angled in a way that produces a doubled reflection of the terrace interior, and as I came fully abreast of it, I saw her reflection before I saw her directly. She was standing at the far viewport wall, 70 meters from where I was, her back toward the main corridor and her hands hanging at her sides. The reflection was doubled and not sharp. That is the nature of the glass at that angle and that distance. But it was sharp enough to see what I saw. I stopped. She was not making any sound that reached me through the glass. She was standing at the viewport with her arms at her sides and her head slightly bowed, and the doubled reflection showed me her face turned partly toward the glass, not because she was aware of me, not toward any audience, simply turned in that direction because that was where her face happened to be at that moment. And I could see, in the imprecise image the glass produced, that she had been crying, not performing grief. Not in the way a person cries when they know they might be observed and are waiting to be acknowledged. In the way a person cries when they have been alone long enough that they have stopped managing the face they put toward the room. The way a face looks when it is with something that is simply true, and there is no reason to make it look like anything other than what it is. I stood in the corridor for a time I cannot accurately measure. It was long enough that I became aware of having stood there. In 12 years of integration work, I had sat across from delegation officers who were frustrated, who were contained in their fury, who were diplomatic in their contempt for decisions I had made or forwarded. I had sat across from representatives who left my office with harder problems than they had arrived with and thanked me with exact formal courtesy and disliked me behind the courtesy, and I had understood that and worked within it. It was, in a way I had not examined until that moment, manageable. Frustration and contained fury and diplomatic contempt are forms of pressure applied outward, toward the desk, toward the officer behind it, toward the protocol that produced the outcome. They are adversarial at their core, and I had been trained to work within adversarial frames. What I was looking at through the glass was not adversarial. It was not directed at me or at the desk or at Protocol 16 or at the Integration Directorate's charter revision that had superseded the Outer Compact Supplement framework. It was entirely interior, entirely hers. The face of a person who has been alone long enough and who has run out of ways to manage what is simply true through preparation and careful documentation, and another carefully formatted request submitted at the earliest possible date. The Kethorvath Sovereignty's medical supply clause, 47 days instead of 60, 13 days short, a minimum of 60 additional days of gap added to the resolution timeline for 14 settlement stations and 3 inhabited moon systems. I understood, standing in a corridor at 300 with the East Observation Terrace light warm and indirect behind the glass, exactly what I had done on Wednesday morning. I had enforced the letter of a refiling timeline correctly. I had known, while I was doing it, that the letter and the spirit were not perfectly aligned in that specific instance. I had filed the review notes and moved to the next assignment because the letter was sufficient for the review, and I had a great many items on the desk. She was still at the viewport. I made a decision. I have thought about whether to characterize it as brave or unusual, and I do not think it was either of those things. I think it was simply the decision that a person makes when they have stood somewhere long enough to understand something, and have also understood that understanding it and doing nothing about it are not the same position. I did not go into the terrace. That was not the right move for the moment. I went to my office. I pulled up Protocol 16. I had cited it from memory in approximately 60 review sessions over 3 years. Subsection A establishes the 60-day refiling requirement. Subsection B defines the applicable subprotocol frameworks. Subsection C establishes the documentation requirements. Subsection D governs the timeline exceptions for territories with active emergency designations. I knew all 4. I had stopped reading them some time ago and had been citing from the memory of having read them, which is a completely standard approach to frequently applied material and which has a specific and well-defined failure mode. It fails when there is a section you have not read. Subsection F had been added in the second revision of the current charter, published approximately 18 months after the primary revision. It is 9 paragraphs. Its governing provision, in relevant part, where a legacy secondary clause is filed under a superseded subprotocol framework, and the renegotiation review date falls within a period of 40 to 60 days from the refiling window opening, the reviewing liaison officer may initiate an expedited refiling process at their own discretion, provided that the legacy clause in question falls within the humanitarian priority categories defined in Schedule 3. I read Schedule 3, medical supply agreements for territories with a population above the outer compact secondary threshold, and a certified medical infrastructure dependency rating on file with the Integration Directorate are listed in Schedule 3, Category 1. The Kethorvath sovereignty exceeded the secondary threshold. Their dependency rating was on file. Their legacy secondary clause was a medical supply agreement. I sat in my office at 3:10 on a Thursday morning and read the section of a protocol I had been citing for 3 years without having read it, and I held what that felt like. I'm not going to elaborate. The detailed taxonomy of one's own professional failures, performed carefully in writing, carries a quality of self-satisfaction that the failure does not deserve. What happened is straightforward. I made an error of the specific kind that comes from expertise that has stopped examining itself. I cited from habit a document I had not read in full, and the document contained, in the section I had never read, a direct remedy for the situation I had handled the previous morning without that remedy. I opened the expedited refiling process at 3:17, 40 minutes of work with the documentation queued. I completed the filing at 3:58. I sent a notification to the Kethorvath delegation data specialist at 4:01 brief, with a reference number and a single explanatory sentence, because receiving a message at 4:01 that tells you clearly what has happened and requires no action is a different thing from receiving one that requires a careful response, and I wanted the first thing I gave them on Thursday morning to be the former kind. Then I went to bed. I cannot say with certainty that I slept. My supervisor's message arrived at 7:15. Had I initiated an expedited refiling on the Kethorvath secondary clause, and under what discretionary authority? I replied with the subsection F citation and the Schedule 3 category reference. She replied at 7:30 that this would require a corrected determination notation on my review file. I replied that I understood. She filed it at 7:34. A corrected determination notation is not a complaint upheld. It is the formal record of a liaison officer revising a determination after a review has been filed. It belongs on the record. In 12 years of integration work, I had not had one, which I had always understood as evidence that my work was correct. I now understood it had also been evidence that I had never, in 12 years, revised a determination after filing, not even in the instances where revision might have been warranted, and which I now recognized I had not gone looking for. I held that thought for the moment it deserved and moved on. I arrived in the treaty processing wing at 800. The east observation terrace was empty. I walked the main corridor twice, which is what I do when I am working out how to say something precise and specific and true in a form short enough to be received rather than processed. I found her at 8:43, standing in the corridor outside the secondary conference room with a data tablet. Her cultural attaché was 20 meters further down the corridor. She looked up when I approached, and I watched the working composure, the still, precise, assessing quality she wore in professional settings settle into place. I was aware, in a way I had not been aware before Thursday morning, of the degree to which that composure was deliberately worn. I said, "I need to tell you about a notification your data specialist received at 4:01 this morning." She said she had seen it. She thanked me for the expedited initiation. I said, I should have told you about subsection F on Wednesday morning. I have cited that protocol in approximately 60 review sessions over 3 years, and I have never read that subsection. I want to be direct with you about that. She looked at me with a fractionally less still, fractionally more assessing expression. She held it longer this time than she had on Wednesday. I said, I want to be clear that the corrected determination was the right determination, and that I initiated the expedited process because it was the right process, not to address a notation on my file. Both of those things are true, and the second one being true does not make the first one less relevant. I wanted to say that to you directly. She was quiet, the kind of quiet a person keeps when they are deciding what to do with something they were not expecting. She said, I am aware that you have received a corrected determination notation. I said yes. She said, I did not request that. I said I knew. She had not requested it and she had not complained. She had thanked me formally and left the review room and gone to stand at a viewport at 300, and those were two different things, and I thought she should know I understood the difference. A long pause, the kind that follows when something lands and neither party is immediately certain what the ground looks like afterward. She said quietly, 13 days. I said yes. She said, the refiling timeline was 13 days short. We submitted the renegotiation request when we had completed our internal preparation, and we completed our internal preparation as quickly as our delegation's capacity allowed. We were not careless. We were 13 days short because 13 days was the gap that remained after everything we could do. I have been doing this work for 4 years, and I have done it correctly each time, and I came into your office on Wednesday expecting to be told it was manageable. I have worked with 15 integration liaison officers across 11 previous treaty processes, and in every previous instance where a procedural discrepancy arose, the officer found a framework for managing it. I did not know subsection F existed. It is not referenced in the delegation preparation guidelines, and I had read those guidelines in full before we filed our request. I prepared correctly and submitted at the earliest possible date, and it was not enough, and I understand that procedural frameworks are sometimes like that, but I want you to know that I did not arrive at that outcome through carelessness. I arrived at it through 13 days. I said I know. She set the data tablet down on the conference room door ledge with a deliberateness that told me she was managing something. When she looked back at me, her eyes were not wet. She had managed that entirely, but the quality that was in them, the direct, unperformative, steady quality of someone looking at another person who has seen something and has not looked away from it, that was present, and I was not going to pretend it was not. I said, I was assigned to this process to facilitate the renegotiation accurately and fairly. I executed it accurately. I did not execute it fairly because I cited a protocol from memory without having read it in full, and the full text contained a direct remedy for this situation. That is mine to carry. I am carrying it. I wanted you to know that I understand the distinction between those two things, and that I understand what it cost you. She was quiet for a longer moment. Then she said something in well-sworn formal register. Her cultural attaché had drifted back toward us during the last part of our exchange, and he later translated it for me. An apology offered with this degree of precision is not a thing that requires acceptance. It requires recognition, and I am recognizing it. I have received formal delegation acknowledgments in all 11 formats covered by the Integration Directorate's Cultural Forms training. I have received commendations and complaints and formal censures, and once, memorably, a delegation head who simply stood up mid-review and left the room without a word, which the Cultural Forms training later informed me was a high-register endorsement in his home sovereignty. None of it carried quite the weight of what she had just said, because none of it had been chosen with quite that degree of deliberateness. The weight of a person who knew what she was offering and chose to offer it precisely and without excess. I said thank you. She said the expedited refiling, the timeline. I told her the expedited process. Once the secondary review board approved the discretionary initiation, typically completed in 14 to 18 standard days. The clause would be certified for inclusion in the primary renegotiation by the close of the current review cycle. She said that is good. I said it is. A different kind of quiet settled between us after that. Not the procedural quiet of a review session, not the loaded quiet of what we had each said and what had been said in return. A quieter quiet, the kind that has sat through the harder variety and emerged from it. Her cultural attaché moved further down the corridor. It was 900 on a Friday morning, and the East Corridor has its own quality at that hour. The viewport panels carry the morning's warm amber. The treaty processing wing runs its ordinary sounds in the background, and the corridor itself is not busy. I had walked this corridor for 3 years and had not attended to the quality of the light or the sound in any particular way. I attended to both that morning. She said, I have had, across 11 treaty processes and 4 years in this role, a consistent experience of integration liaison work. The work is accurate. It is often very accurate. It is not always fair. I have found ways to work within that because the work still produces better outcomes than the alternatives, and I understand that complex procedural systems fail in proportion to their complexity. But I want to tell you that what you did this morning was different from accurate. And I want you to know that I noticed the difference. I said, I noticed that you didn't expect me to. She said, no, I didn't. I said, I am sorry I gave you reason to expect less. She said, I believe you. The renegotiation continued through the following week. I ran 2 additional review sessions, processed 3 supplemental documentation requests, approved the expedited refiling certification when it came back at day 16. I filed the completed primary renegotiation review at the end of the 3rd week. My supervisor reviewed and filed it without additional comment. The corrected determination notation remained on my file, which is correct. On the last day of the renegotiation, a Wednesday, I passed Queen Regent Ethys Orville in the main corridor at 1400. Her delegation had completed their final documentation review and were moving at a steady pace toward the departure transit bay. She stopped when she saw me, and her officers continued at their pace with the efficiency of a delegation that moves well together. She said, Liaison Officer Corin. I said, Queen Regent. She said, I want to say something before we leave, and I want to say it here rather than in the formal departure notation, because formal departure notations are accurate and what I want to say requires a different register. I said I was listening. She said, I have been Queen Regent for 4 years. In that time, I have worked with institutions that have the best available procedures and the personnel who know how to execute them. And I have found that the gap between the procedure and the person, between what a framework says and what the person applying it understands about why it was written, is where most things go wrong. Not through malice, not through the kind of carelessness that comes from not trying, but through the kind of competence that stops reading a document at the section that has always been sufficient. She paused. She said, you read the rest of the section. I said, later than I should have. She said, yes, and you told me that directly without making the telling of it about you. And you accepted the notation on your file without transferring the weight of it to me or to the refiling window or to Protocol 16. I want you to know that I noticed each of those things separately, because each of them required a separate decision, and each of the decisions was the right one. I said I had an example to work from. She looked at me. I said, you could have filed a formal complaint on Wednesday morning. The grounds were available to you and they were legitimate. You chose not to. You chose to go stand at a viewport at 300 and carry what you were carrying without transferring the weight of it outward. I noticed that separately from everything else. I wanted you to know I noticed it. A pause. She said I was not carrying it well. I said you were carrying it honestly. That is not the same as not carrying it well. She held that. Then she said something brief in Vel-Sorn formal register, and I did not need the translation to understand the register of it, because some things are communicated through the quality of the saying more than through the words themselves. Then, in standard compact, the Kethorvath sovereignty will have occasion to submit renegotiation processes in the years ahead. I do not make requests of integration officers informally, as a rule. But I would like you to know that if there is a way within your assignment processes for you to be involved in those reviews, I believe the sovereignty's interests would be well served by that involvement. I said I would note it. She said good. Her cultural attaché appeared at the corridor entrance. She turned toward the transit bay. Then she stopped once and turned back and looked at me with the amber gold eyes that had been carrying most of the real weight of the past 4 days. Not the formal recognition she had offered, which was real and which I held carefully, but what was underneath it. The quality of a person who has expected, for long enough that the expectation has become structural, to be failed by the instruments around them. Who has been given one instance of something different, and who is holding that instance carefully. Not because she is fragile, but because she understands that the things worth holding carefully are worth the care. She said, "Thank you for reading the rest of the section." I said, "I am sorry it took until Thursday." She said it was still Thursday. Then she walked to the transit bay, and the east corridor was empty, and I stood in it for a moment with the afternoon light from the viewport panels. I went back to my office. I opened the next assignment and read the applicable protocol from the beginning, all of it, including every subsection, and I took notes in the margins of my working file the way I had not done in approximately 7 years. It took longer than my standard preparation. It was the right amount of time. I keep a review file that I update at the close of each assignment. Formal record and personal notation column. 12 years of personal notations, all of them procedural observations. The notation I added at the close of the Kethorvath renegotiation reads, "Read all subsections before citing." The second notation, which I have not done before in 12 years. When someone has prepared carefully to work with you, be worth the preparation. I am working on that one. It is a different kind of work. The Kethorvath sovereignty's next renegotiation cycle is 14 months from now. I submitted the assignment preference request this morning. The system may not accommodate it. Someone else may manage the process, and if they do, I hope they read subsection F before they file the review. But I submitted the request. That is the correct first move. You know what matters, you file it, you show up for what the system assigns you, and in the meantime you read the whole protocol. Every subsection, including the ones that have always seemed supplementary. That is all the story, told at the length it requires, which is the length of 4 days, and a viewport at 300, and a quiet recognition in a corridor at 1400, and 13 days that were simply 13 days. Not a failure of will or of care, just the gap between what was done and what the window required. 13 days. And a liaison officer who read the rest of the section 1 day too late and said so and was believed. That is worth something. I intend to make it worth more. There is something I left out of the account I gave above, and I am going to go back for it now, because I think it belongs in any honest telling of those 4 days, and because the version without it is complete in terms of the procedural record, but incomplete in terms of the thing I am actually trying to describe. On the Friday morning, after the exchange in the corridor outside the secondary conference room, after I had said what I had to say and she had said what she had to say, and the cultural attaché had provided the formal translation, and we had each sat for a moment with what the other had said, there was an interval of perhaps 10 minutes during which neither of us went anywhere. Her cultural attaché was down the corridor. My own next appointment was not until 1000. The secondary conference room behind her was occupied by her data specialists and her 2 senior delegation officers. The East Corridor at 900 on a Friday is not empty, but it is not busy, and the people who passed us did so at the particular pace of treaty processing staff, who have learned not to interrupt a corridor conversation that has the quality of 2 people choosing to remain in a space rather than moving to the next thing. She said, during that interval, something that was not part of the formal exchange and that I have thought about since. She said, "I have a nephew who is 14 years old and who will be sovereign within 3 years. I have spent 4 years preparing him. Not preparing him in the way that formal education prepares a future sovereign, the political frameworks, the historical precedents, the governance theory. I mean the other preparation. The preparation for the reality that systems built by people to do correct things will sometimes fail to do right things, and that a sovereign must learn to tell the difference, and must learn to hold both the correctly executed failure and the correctly executed repair with equal honesty." He is 14. He is beginning to understand the distinction. I have been finding these 4 years that it is difficult to teach. She paused. She was looking at the viewport at the far end of the corridor, not at me. She said, "What you did this morning, the way you described what had happened and why it had happened and what you were carrying about it, was one of the cleaner examples of that distinction that I have seen in 4 years of watching how institutions handle their own errors. I am going to tell him about it." I said, "I would prefer it if the specific error were not the part he remembered." She said, "The error is not the point. The error is just what happened. The point is what came after and how it was carried." I did not have an immediate response to that. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who has thought carefully about something and has arrived at a view of it that she is not performing, just stating. It is a different register from persuasion or from compliment, and I have found over the years that the most useful things said to me have been in that register, by people who were not trying to make me feel a particular way, but were simply telling me what they saw. I said, "I will try to be worth the example." She said, "That is all anyone can do." I have thought about that exchange more, in the weeks since the Kethorvath delegation departed, than I have thought about almost anything else in those 4 days. More than the Protocol 16 subsection, more than the 401 notification, more than the corrected determination notation. There is something in it that I am still working out. I think what I am working out is this. For 12 years I have understood my job as the management of processes. Accurate processes, properly cited processes, processes executed to the standard required by the applicable protocol. And that is what the job is, correctly understood. But it is not all the job is. The job is also, and I had somehow arrived at 12 years of doing it without having internalized this fully, the thing that the process is meant to serve. The system underneath the system. The reason Protocol 16 was written, and the reason subsection F was added to it in the second revision, and the reason Schedule 3 exists at all and has Category 1 in it. Medical supply agreements for territories above the secondary threshold, Category 1. Not because the people who wrote it were making a theoretical point about humanitarian priorities, but because someone sat down and asked what happens when a 60-day window and a 47-day submission, and a sovereign who prepared correctly and submitted at the earliest possible date combined to produce a gap, and they wrote subsection F as the answer to that question. Someone had been in the room with a situation very like Wednesday's, and they had understood what the letter of the protocol was producing, and they had written a correction into the system. I had been citing that system without reading it. I had been, for 3 years, stepping over the correction that someone had taken the time to install. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Not my error in isolation. Errors in isolation are simply errors, and I have made errors before and corrected them and moved on. But the specific quality of this one, the fact that someone had already identified this class of problem and had already installed the remedy, and I had been executing the system in which that remedy lived without having read far enough to know it was there. The people who built the framework had been right. The framework contained the answer. I had not been reading the framework. I have been a more careful reader since Thursday morning. I know that sounds like a small thing for the scale of what I am claiming about it, and I will not pretend it is a large or dramatic change. But the reading carefully, the reading all of it, including the sections that have always seemed supplementary, including the sections added in secondary revisions 18 months after the primary, that is not nothing. It is the difference between a process that is accurate and one that is fair, and that difference has a name, and the name is subsection F, and I now know where it lives. There is one other thing. I have a colleague in the Integration Coordination Office named Reth Orville who has been a secondary liaison officer for 7 years and who handles, on average, 3 to 4 active assignments at a time, which is a standard load. He is competent. He files clean reviews. He maintains unimpeachable timelines. He has never had a corrected determination notation on his file. He reminded me of myself before Thursday, in the specific way that a person reminds you of yourself when you see them doing a thing you have been doing, and are now in the process of examining from a slight distance. I told him about subsection F not in the way of reporting an error or creating a formal lesson. I told him the way I am telling this, which is to say directly and with the full account of how I had come to know about it. I showed him where it was in the document. I told him about Schedule 3. He read it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had also been citing Protocol 16 from memory. He said he thought he should probably read the rest of it. I said that was what I thought too. He has, as far as I know, done so. I cannot speak to what he found in the parts he had not previously read. That is his to carry, in whatever form it requires. But I thought it was worth telling him. I have been thinking since the Kethorveth renegotiation about the difference between the kind of correction that stays inside the corrected determination notation, filed, archived, visible to supervisors, constituting a permanent note on the record, and the kind of correction that moves, that spreads. That becomes, in the terms I have been using, the right kind of efficiency, not the efficiency of speed and habit and successfully processed desk items, but the efficiency of a system that has been read carefully and is therefore closer to what it was written to be. Reth Orville read the rest of Protocol 16. I do not know whether he found anything in it that he had been citing without having read. I did not ask, but he read it, and that means whatever was there, he now knows it is there, which means when the situation that needs it arrives at his desk, he will have it available to him. That seems to me like a thing worth having done. The Kethorvath Sovereignty's next renegotiation cycle is 14 months from now. I submitted the assignment preference request, as I said. I have also spent the past several weeks reading, in full, every protocol document in my standard citation set. Not because I expect to find another subsection F in every one of them. Some of them I have now read in their entirety for the 3rd or 4th time, and found nothing I did not already know. But because the reading carefully is itself the practice, and the practice is what I am building, and 14 months is enough time to build something that matters by the time the renegotiation opens. If I am assigned to it, and I may not be, the system distributes assignments by factors that include officer load and availability and prior involvement with the relevant sovereignty, all of which give me a reasonable case. I want to be ready for it in the way I was not ready on Wednesday. Not because I expect another subsection F to be the issue, but because I understand now that there is a quality of readiness that is different from having done something 60 times, and that quality is what Queen Regent Ethys Orville prepared for 11 previous processes and brought into my filing room on a Wednesday morning at 900. And what I owed her in return, and what I am working on. She said it was still Thursday. She was right. It was still Thursday. The correction was on Thursday, and Thursday was not yet Friday, and there was still time, and I used it, And that is a fact about those 4 days that I intend to carry forward and not in the direction of self-satisfaction. It was still Thursday. I will try to make sure that from now on, the things that need to be done are done before Thursday has to be the answer. That is the whole story.